Halloween, 1972. My face was broken, the cheekbones, the jaw. My head had gone through the windshield of the Volkswagen Bug and then my leg, as the seat broke backwards, and then my face again, and my pelvis and my ribs hitting things, or being hit, ricocheting. I have a body memory of my right eye out of its socket, lying in wetness on my cheek. And then there was blackness, unconsciousness, coma. Once a kind-faced doctor tried cheering me. "You've only lost about 10 to 15% of your IQ, he said. That's plenty left." Did he not know that his patient who could not do her times tables was a professor of sociology who taught advanced statistics at a major research university? She had not the slightest idea now what 10 to 15% meant, but she could feel the word, lost. What had I lost? Much more than IQ points. I'd lost access to my brain. I had lost language, my sword and my shield. My habitual routes for naming things were torn up, blocked off. Paths to words and formulae were gone. I could not locate where anything was stored in my brain. I could feel my mind searching, this way, no that way, up here, try there, searching in my brain, as if it were a computer, searching for words, thoughts, connections, searching for memory, endless searches. Sometimes I could sense the place where a word was hiding, but I couldn't make it come out, be recognized, be spoken. When I could find the word's first letter, I felt grateful. I still do. Everything was jumbled in my brain. A massive upheaval had cracked the strata of knowledge, throwing long-buried sedimentia to the surface. As if I'd experienced an earthquake in my brain, the orderly strata of knowledge had been destroyed. Old material collided with new material. The shards had been reshuffled. After the car accident and coma, I could not find simple words, much less remember proper names, dates, titles of papers or journals, or perform statistical tests or fourth-grade arithmetic. Although I could not bring into speech what was happening in my head, I found that I could write about it. If I could not find the word I wanted, I could write its first letter or leave the blank space. In writing, the pace and the issues were my own, not the maddening question of others. Writing allowed me to record little thoughts, to revisit them and fill in the blanks, to piece them together, thought by thought, to revisit them and fill in the blanks. Writing gave me a feeling of control over time and space, and of faith that I would recover. Writing was the method through which I constituted the world and reconstituted myself. Writing became my principal tool through which I learned about myself and the world. I wrote so I would have a life. Writing was and is how I come to know. 2 years after the car accident, writing the first textbook on the sociology of gender, the dynamics of sex and gender, was how I relearned sociological basics and helped construct the new specialty, the sociology of gender, as non-dependent on advanced statistics. Through that writing, I also constructed myself as a feminist researcher interested in understanding how social and cultural factors influenced relationships between men and women and women, men and men. I came to a deeper understanding of gender scripts. 2 decades later, I wrote an article for the Handbook of Qualitative Research entitled Writing, a Method of Inquiry. The seeds for that article were planted during my recovery from my car accident. A quarter of a century after the car accident, I would name myself writer in the introduction of my book, Fields of Play, Constructing an Academic Life. In Fields of Play, I wrote what I called writing stories, narratives that situated my sociological work in academic, disciplinary, community, and familial contexts. My claims to knowledge were contextualized, historically situated. Because of writing stories, I am now able to write about the body and mind trauma which I experienced but could not witness, its aftermath, the coma, the reshaping of my life, pain, and loss, remembered as I write. This is from Getting Personal Writing Stories, and the author is Laurel Richardson. This was published in Qualitative Studies in Education in 2001, and it's really worth getting the whole article and reading. Anything is worth reading, actually. As I go through this presentation, I'd like you to think about what you just heard and see if you can place it into the narrative landscape that we're going to be talking about today. So what is life writing? Well, Life writing is both method and text. That is, it's both process, that is the way of doing it, and it's artifact. So the outcome of that is the text. It examines personal identity and culture. And remember, we talked about narrative as identity. So life writing obviously is about identity. Identity, a critical reflection on your identity, transforming identity, and sharing identity and transforming both and perspectives with both your audience and your participants. And it uses autobiographical memory. So you write your narrative out of your memory. Remember when we looked at the first week, narrative methods, feminist narrative methods, we looked at the various turns in narrative inquiry, and we looked at the turn to language, or the posts, as we call it, as where we are right now in terms of methodology. So narrative research method begins with experiences as expressed in lived and told stories of individuals. So that means that the research method involves gathering stories, hearing stories, gathering stories, interpreting stories. We're going to look at autobiography, which is when people tell their own life experiences, and that doesn't always include their interpretation. It can be a straight account of their life experiences, but of course, as they're accounting, what they're doing is curating their life experiences, right? They're choosing to tell certain things and not choosing to tell others. So in a sense, they're sorting through, they're choosing, they're making decisions, they're interpreting. Narrative inquiry, however, focuses more specifically on the journey of the author, combining scholarship, personal stories, and universalizable themes in a seamless manner. Universalizable is a word that's going to come up again when we talk about assessing narratives that you read and write. Note that it's quite different from generalizability. It also includes how a story is told. So when you are writing, remember those three dimensions, temporality and sociology and space. So when you have gathered narratives and you are constructing your narrative report, you're talking also about how your storytellers told their story. That in particular relates to context. Narrative is concerned with how individuals make meaning out of an experience and usually focus on an event being the storying of the event. And this is where memory comes in. So autobiographical memory is really the core of narrative. And it's a cognitive process in which the author, the storyteller, reconstructs the event to understand its meaning. So in reconstructing it, you're reconstruing it again. You're deciding what to include, what not to include. You're organizing your memories, you're interpreting your memories, you're curating. Autoethnography, on the other hand, analyzes one's personal experience in the specific context of the surrounding culture. So you're talking about yourself as a cultural insider. So you're interested in primarily in examining the cultural and contextual influences on a writer's self-reflection. Maya Angelou says there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. Can you think about untold stories that you have now and what you need to tell in order, in Maya Angelou's words, to heal? Telling stories is an ancient art that started long before humans invented writing. People tell stories when they gossip, tell jokes, or reminisce about the past. Written forms of narration include most forms of writing: personal essays, fairy tales, short stories, novels, plays, screenplays, autobiographies, histories, even news stories have a narrative. Narratives may be a sequence of events in chronological order or an imagined tale with flashbacks or multiple timelines. But they are reflective. What matters most in personal narrative writing is the conviction that the writer's own life actually testifies. It matters. And in the end, what truly matters is the sense of meaning that the writer is able to create and convey, both to self and to others. So again, narrative writing is a cognitive process. The procedures for implementing this research consist of focusing on studying one or more two individuals or more. I once did a study with 24 individuals, gathering data through the collection of their stories, reporting individual experiences, and chronologically ordering the meanings of those experiences. Now, gathering data through the collection of their stories can happen in many different ways, and you can see that there are many forms that they can take. It also involves finding themes that tie the narratives into a cohesive whole. So that's definitely one of the things that you will be doing when you collect your narratives and you have your transcript, is you're going to be analyzing those narratives. So when you analyze them, you're trying to find common themes or come to one theme that creates the narrative or your narrative report. Last week, we talked about the 4 narrative turns, and this is just a revisit, I guess, of that. So primarily, narrative is relational. It's a relational form of inquiry, which really suits feminist methods very well. The parties to narrative inquiry are in relationship with each other at all times. And you're going to learn and change together because of this relationship. So to be a narrative researcher, you have to accept that you are going to be changed by the stories that people tell you. And in turn, they're going to be changed by the stories that you tell them. So it's all going to be embedded in context. And you can't get stories away from that context. And that's why you have to share context. Remember that that's one of the dimensionalities, right? Second, we moved from numbers to to words as data. And that's a recognition that in translating experiences to numeric code loses the nuances of experience and relationship. Remember, we sort of talked about statistical surveys, for example, where you see a trend or emerge, but you really want to know what's underneath the meanings there. So plot lines, character, setting, and action provide ways of holding meaning together in relational, complex, and nuanced ways. So again, there's context, and there's sociality, and there's temporality and space. So this turn started the conversation about measures of reliability and reliability. We're going to look at them a little bit later. In the third turn, from the general to the particular, we're talking about looking at a particular experience that people have in a particular time and space. And these often become the theoretical basis for grassroots movements, rhetorical basis, such as the women's movement, civil rights, and others. And we talked a little bit last week about women's ways of knowing, which was a seminal text. And it argued that narrative and storytelling constitute a gendered epistemology. So there comes that question again. Is your epistemology gendered, or is there such a thing as a gendered epistemology? And fourth, we learn knowing by unraveling the certainties of positivistic social sciences. There are no certainties in narrative. Narratives reflect knowledge as contextualized, shared by members of a community, and providing a context in which knowledge can be evaluated again. So there's that context, sociality, temporality, space. What's key here is that narratives are stories. They tell stories, they are stories. They have characters in those stories, and they're imploded. When people tell you a story, they're imploding that story again and choosing what it is to tell you and in what order. Nosh and Bradley give you a list of 10 guidelines for narrative. So these are guidelines to keep in mind when you're developing your interview protocol, or the way that you're going to conduct your narrative conversation, the way that you're going to tell your story, and also what structures you're going to elicit when people are telling stories for you. So narratives, for one thing, claim a distinct voice. As a narrator and writer, that can be your voice, right? But it's distinct and you talk about that in your narrative beginning. You also identify key themes that will run throughout the writing. Now, you don't have to do this right at the beginning, but it's usually a good idea to do it at the beginning. And you're not going to discuss them in any depth, but you're going to indicate that these are the themes that people need to watch for when they read the stories and the story excerpts. You're going to allow your own story. And that's a very important part of a narrative beginning. So remember, it all starts in autobiographical memory. So you need to share that. You share it through positionality, you share it through reflexivity, you share it through your story. In me search and we search, we talk about, again, the relationality of narratives. So you're researching yourself, you're exploring yourself when you're telling your stories. And together, you and your participants are exploring themselves and yourself again. And you're concerned with particularity. We talked, remember, about that? Universalizability, concreteness, and abstractness. Practice and theory. We're going to go back to universalizability, certainly. The stories, obviously, are stories about people's lives, and they are concrete. You may introduce abstractness when you're talking about themes, but narratives practice, definitely practice, and theory. In developing the narrative or your narrative report, you're going to use scholarly literature in the service of the story and not vice versa. That is, you're going to use it to ground support and critique points that you are making in the narrative, but it's not necessarily going to stand alone. Now, you are going to read narrative papers in which the Lit Review does stand alone, and very often this is because those are author guidelines provided by the journal that you want to publish in, or the venue that you want to publish in. But for our purposes, you don't need to do it all at the beginning if you don't want to. You can weave it in as you're developing themes and providing excerpts. When you're writing narratively, you're taking risks rather than following necessarily expected outlines and formulas. Now, I just contradicted that, right? So if you're writing, when you're writing, depends on who you're writing for, right? So think about your audience. What kind of readers are in your audience? If it's an academic audience and you're publishing in, say, a journal of qualitative research, you're more likely to follow an expected kind of outline and formulas. So statement of the problem, why it's important, literature review, blah, blah, blah. If you're writing for more narrative journals, then you have a little more leeway. If you're writing for me, you have lots of leeway. A personal story is a story worth telling, leading to a point worth making. I think that's pretty obvious when you're talking about narratives. You're striving to write in a way that's fun and engaging, rather than using really dry, jargony, academic prose, which is definitely a concern and a critique of post-structuralism, for instance, that it's very jargony and it's very detached. You're writing in the first person, always. You're writing in the first person, and you're writing in a way that is emotive and that's engaging. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have academic vigor. You are going to have academic vigor, and you're going to do it in ways that we will discuss later. For example, by making sure that your story is resonant, that you are trustworthy as an author, and other kinds of claims. Assessing a scholarly narrative has been a matter of some debate, and we'll take a look at those a little bit later on in the course. But basically, you replace the terms, positivistic terms like validity, with truth criteria. What are the truth criteria that we're going to look at? Well, we'll take a look at that later. And we're going to replace reliability with universalizability. So does this story speak to you, for example, of the human condition? Are there insights that you're going to be able to provide that are kind of universal truths? This is in quotation marks. Here are some narratives to check out. I'm not going to leave this on very long because you can return to it. But I will say that the Britzman narrative is a book now. It was their doctoral dissertation, I think. And it's quite lovely. And Clendenin writes very often with participants and many co-authors. And she talks about early school leavers. They talk about early school leavers, and that's a really good one too. Jerome Bruner, I talked about him last week, I think, a little bit. He wrote Acts of Meaning, and I highly recommend that book. It's a seminal work, even though it's 1995. He talks, remember, about connoisseurship, which is something that you develop when you're a narrative researcher. He mostly talks actually about autobiography rather than narrative, although I shouldn't say rather because they're all part of that narrative landscape. But remember, you start with a narrative beginning in your writing, and generally that's your personal autobiography. Bruner considers the narrator as the protagonist in the story, the main character in the story, and the main character has the agency in the story. So there are different sort of cultural forms of narrative. And Jerome Bruner characterizes Western narratives as representing themes of individuality, power, and autonomy, while rural Malaysian narratives include the shamanistic notion of inner wind, based on a mix of humoral medicine, cosmological, and aesthetic beliefs about what controls life. Of course, there's been a fair amount of research on cultural forms of narrative. You may take issue with some of them. Certainly, this is not the final word on what narratives in different cultures look like. But the research suggests that Western narratives are chronological in nature. They're oriented around major events or emblematic events or disorienting dilemmas or crises. It examines the stages in crisis from the private to the public. So you might begin your personal autobiography and your narrative beginning telling of an event that's really affected your life, for example. For me, as I've shared, that might be the death of my sister. And it reflects agency. So you are, as the narrator there, the agent of the story. You're the protagonist, you're the agent of the story, and you have agency in the story. Moroccan narratives tend to be non-chronological. And as we've said, the protagonist is at the mercy of these outer forces. Whereas African American narratives tend to be historical and may reference fugitive slave narratives, include the poetics of alienation and redemption. I've included a few in the references. Canadian Indigenous, and of course I'm not qualified to speak about Canadian Indigenous narratives, but the research so far suggests that they vary from the sacred to the historical and focus on social, political, and cultural ways, can be entertaining, even humorous, tell a personal family, community, or an entire nation's experiences, can be owned by one family or clan, but others can be told by anyone who knows them and cares for them, reflect the perceptions, relationships, beliefs, and attitudes of a particular people, are the interplay of memory and imagination. And when you are developing, or I was going to say developing Canadian Indigenous narratives, or when you have Indigenous storytellers or participants, you really need to pay attention to ownership. Verisimilitude is one of those characteristics that you take a look at when you're assessing the quality of narratives, what Stephen Colbert might call truthiness. And negotiability is when the reader determines whether or not the narrator is sympathetic, worth caring about. This quality permits entry into the conversation of lives. This is one of the implicit contracts that you have with participants in your study. Here are some autobiographies to check out. So I'm not going to linger again on the slide. You can return to it later. I highly recommend you read anything by Billy Ray Belcourt, who was an undergraduate student at the U of A in Native Studies and has gone on to do a PhD, I believe, in Oxford. He's achieved many, many awards. And Audre Lorde, obviously, if you're a feminist researcher, you have to read Audre Lorde. So autoethnography is something that I've become very, very interested in, and probably my writing now tends more towards autoethnography than it does to narrative inquiry, although, again, they're all included in the narrative landscape. So autoethnography is the intersection of autobiography and ethnography in that it uses personal experience to describe and interpret cultural texts, experiences, beliefs, and practices. So in an autoethnography, you are writing as a member of a particular culture. Now that could be any culture. It could be the teaching culture. It could be the culture of a social media user. It could be the culture of a dog lover. It could be the culture of mothers with young children. It can be any culture. The point is, though, that you are the insider in this culture. And so you are interpreting the culture and critical of the culture for your readers. Autoethnography, as opposed to some autobiographies, is academic. So it's not just your story. It's your story with reference to scholarly literature, and it includes critique and interpretation. It starts with positionality and is reflexive throughout the entire piece. What you're trying to do in an autoethnography is identify and interrogate intersections between yourself and the social life. So yourself and your political, cultural, social contexts that you exist in. Fundamentally, you want to show people in the process of figuring out what to do, how to live, and the meaning of their struggles. So when you're talking about autoethnographies, what you're talking about is eliciting stories of epiphanies, personal epiphanies, yours or other, that personal epiphanies that others share with you. Very often that includes a crisis, an identity crisis, a disorienting dilemma, a sudden realization of something. So when you're writing them, they are highly emotive and personal, never written in the third person, may and often do contain excerpts from poetry, from music, from other arts-based artifacts. They're humanizing. You want to draw people into your story. And one of the reasons that you want to do that is because you want to share the culture and you want to correct any misapprehensions or misconstructs that people have. So this is a visual representation of ethnography on the left and autoethnography on the right. So you see that there are some difference here. So ethnographers are striving to produce a thick description of a culture and from a detached kind of viewpoint. So you're trying to facilitate understanding of a culture for both insiders and outsiders. And they are creating an inductive description of patterns of cultural experience. Usually the data are field notes, observations, artifacts, not necessarily interviews. Whereas when you're writing autoethnography, you seek to produce aesthetic and evocative thick descriptions of personal and interpersonal experience. So again, aesthetic, emotive, engaging. You accomplish this by first discerning patterns of cultural experience, and there can be journal entries, field notes, interviews, artifacts, memories, all kinds of things, and using facets of storytelling, showing and telling, and authorizations of their authorial voice. So you might be telling the story, you've got that authorial voice, but you might include someone else telling pieces of their story, and so the voices might switch. But you're trying to produce accessible texts because you want to read wide audiences. So often autoethnographies are not just for other scholars, but they're for wider, more public audiences. They're for communities. Very often this is used as activist research with oppressed communities, for example, vulnerable communities and marginalized communities. And autoethnographies have that reputation and that motivation, actually, to make social change possible for more people. So it's a moral responsibility when you're, well, it always is, but when you're developing an autoethnography, your responsibility is to the people in that particular community. Many types of autoethnography. You don't need to know all of them unless you get passionate about autoethnography. You can have, for example, a collaborative autoethnography. That's really like a co-constructed narrative. And so that's when many people take turns telling the story about the culture. So they're all cultural insiders. You're all cultural insiders in a community developing this autoethnography. So why is autoethnography a beloved feminist method? Because we get to include subjugated knowledges in these. So we speak against or provide alternatives, dominant, taken for granted, and harmful cultural scripts, stories, and stereotypes. So again, in autoethnography, we're concerned with power and oppression. Levi Strauss was an anthropologist, a French anthropologist that first coined this word, bricolage. And the meaning of it is creating something new out of existing parts. Sherry Turkle, for example, from MIT, who wrote Life on the Screen, wrote about coding as bricolage and as a particularly feminist way of coding, which I think is kind of interesting. Think about bricolage as creating a quilt. So you have these squares that in and of themselves have meaning, that are visual, but they, and they have that kind of meaning, and then they're collated together into a quilt, which has that kind of larger meaning. So quilting is bricolage. Think about narrative writing as bricolage. Again, here are some autoethnographies to check out. Many of them all of them very powerful. They're mostly books. Although some of them are articles. Looking at any journal of qualitative inquiry or qualitative research, you'll find that more and more autoethnographies have been accepted. Now, what about data for autoethnographies? Very much like narrative inquiry, all kinds of sources of data that you can use in an autoethnography, and here are just some of them. So what autoethnographers do is they capture these sources of data or these artifacts or these journal entries or whatever they are, and then they craft them together, again, in an evocative narrative that tries to capture lived experience of the researcher and co-participants in relation to the phenomena under study. And that phenomena, again, really can be anything that occurs as you're living your life, in your social life. It could be the phenomena of death. It could be the phenomena of gaslighting. It could be the phenomena of love, I guess. It can be any kind of phenomena that you're looking at. You're part of the culture represented by that phenomena. Now, a little later on, we're going to talk a lot about ethical issues because the ethical attitude underlies all narrative research because it's relational, right? You're always in relationship with your storytellers, with your participants, with your co-participants. So you have this ethical obligation to them to keep them safe, that preserve their dignity, that you respect them, that you not reveal hurtful things about them, that they are your partners in this narrative. So you have implicit and explicit contracts. So obviously your explicit contract is the letter of consent, in which you try to imagine the things that might be risky, and of course your goal is to minimize risk. But you also have implicit contracts, the kinds of contracts that you have, obviously, with your friends and in your relationship. For example, suppose that you are conducting a narrative study on sexual abuse. Well, that's going to be great. There's going to have great potential there for emotional harm, psychological harm. And an implicit contract might involve you having at hand protocols for distress. So you might have phone numbers for a sexual abuse center. You might do the interviews in a particular context that's very safe. You might go and the extra mile, for instance, in making sure that there's, it's not the extra mile, let's face it, making sure that there's Kleenex and that kind of thing. Lots of breaks, comfort breaks for people. The ability to get up and just walk out and come back, or maybe not come back. These are all kinds of implicit contract things that you should negotiate with your participants. Obviously, you're promising anonymity and confidentiality, and you're thinking through your choices. So you have many dilemmas of choice when you're conducting narrative research. And let me tell you one that also describes scholarly good versus moral good. So I was doing a narrative study on female instructional designers, and I knew all of them. So it was a very, it gone a long way to develop trust and rapport. I'd worked with many of them, actually, so they knew me very well. So in one of these stories that was being recounted, there was an identity crisis that the sister of the instructional designer had, and it became absolutely pivotal to her identity development as a designer. So, as usual, I did a lot of member checks with my participants. So that involved transcribing the interviews, sharing those first transcripts, asking if people remembered talking about that. Did they want to add anything to it? Is there anything that they don't want accessible to anyone? So they wanted to take it out, they wanted to cross it out, and so on. Do that a number of times as a study develops. And at some point, I had the first draft for my narrative report, the paper I was going to write, that I shared with everybody, and said, "This is, this is what I intend to publish, and what were your thoughts about it, your feedback on it?" And this instructional designer was very, very upset at me. She said, "You can't possibly use that story about my sister." And I said, "Well, it was in the transcript all along, and you approved the transcript, and you didn't take it out." And she said, "But I've changed my mind. It will be too painful for my family to read." And even though I knew her family wasn't going to read it because it was an academic article, nevertheless, it would have been very harmful for her and harmful to our relationship if I included it. Now, at that point, I could have included it because she had many, many chances to take it out. But I had to decide between the scholarly good and the moral good. And of course, I chose the moral good. I was in relationship with her. The promise of narrative research is that you are going to hold people's stories in great respect, and there's no possible way that I could cause that kind of emotional harm. And so I had to remove that story, sadly, because the paper sure wasn't as good. But there was no way I could go forward. Now, you'll have to decide things like that on, when you're doing your narrative studies. What are you going to include? Even if you're legally able to include it, are you going to include it? And that really goes to trust and rapport. So I've gone a long way to develop trust and rapport, even though I was highly criticized by male researchers in my group. So I had one study, for example, of 4 teachers and faculty members. It took about a year, so there were lots and lots of conversations. But first, I had identified a room that we could keep for that year, and I put flowers in it and pictures and comfortable chairs, and there was always food. And when that door closed and we started talking, we were talking in camera, but in family at the same time. We had breakfast with each other. We had coffee with each other. We socialized throughout that project, and after that project, they're still good friends of mine. The goal was to develop trust and rapport. I didn't necessarily My motivation wasn't to develop lifelong friendships, but taking time to develop that trust and rapport is very important. Now, you don't have a lot of time in this course, but there are things that you can do to develop trust and rapport. You can not turn on the tape recorder, for example, and talk just as people getting to know each other. You can send thank you cards. You can make sure that the timing is always the timing that your participant wants. That you meet each other in a space that's safe and that they're comfortable in. That you have at hand your distress protocols, for example. That you attenuate as much as possible. One thing that you're going to promise in your letter of consent, but it's also going to involve a dilemma of choice perhaps, is the idea of withdrawing from the study at any time. So you need to promise that and you need to stick to that. But the question is then what happens with the data? So for example, if you're in a focus group, and there are 4 or 5 people in the focus group, and you're telling stories to each other, and these stories are interwoven with each other that are difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle, and one of the participants withdraws and says they want to withdraw their data, how are they going to do that if these stories are completely entangled and interwoven? Can you do that? Is it possible to do that? So you need always to be conscious that those kinds of things could and will happen, because it never goes smoothly. It never goes the way you think it's going to go. There's always going to be things that arise, and if you can think about them ahead of time, you're much better off. You need to think about who has interpretive authority. We're going to look at that in a bit. And who has the authorial voice? Is it negotiated? You have to decide. These are Laurel Richardson's top 10 thoughts about personal stories and writing as inquiry. And they're good guidelines, I think, for both when you're conducting your research and when you're writing the narrative. So she says people who write are always writing about their own lives all the time. And you might find a positivist that finds that difficult to believe, but you're choosing to do research out of your own life understandings all the time, whether it's positivistic research or it's not, right? So you're involved with that. There may be an experience that has led up to that. While you're doing the research, you're always thinking about it and interpreting it and comparing it to your own life. So it's a method of discovery. It's always done in context. Remember, it's always got temporality, sociality, and space. When you write something, you're going to change your life, or change your understanding of your life when you write, because it's a cognitive process. Here are some references that you might want to take up that include autobiography and autoethnography. Again, I'm not going to linger on them because you can return. Now, collective biography is another form of life story narrative writing, but this takes place in a group. I'm not going to say how big the group is. You need to determine that. But in a collective biography, you're questioning what is known and who can tell about it, and what kind of understanding you're going to come together as a collective. So note that it challenges validity, reliability, objectivity, and generalizability. Of course it does, because it's feminist research, and we don't use those terms when we're talking about feminist research. Collective biography involves memories. So it's biographical writing, and it's the memories of the people that are involved in this process. So you identify a collective, it doesn't have to be that you've all had that memory together, but you identify something that's in common that people will have a memory of. It could be the first day of school. It could be going up for tenure. It could be having your first child. It could be getting married. It could be being diagnosed with something for the first time. So all of the participants in a collective biography have a shared memory of a sort, and then there's the work of telling, listening, sharing, writing, reinterpreting, writing, sharing, reinterpreting, and so on, until you get to sort of this collective insight about this experience. What comes up in narrative writing, of course, is this question about truth, hotly contested, I must say. So one of the questions is, memory reliable? Are your memories reliable? Well, maybe not. In fact, if you think this back to something happened 30 years ago, do you remember all of it? Or do you think, oh, did that happen? Or did that happen first? When you're sharing the memory that you have had with one of your siblings, do you remember it exactly the same way? Well, why don't you remember it exactly the same way? What's involved there? So truth and memory are things that critics, actually, of narrative writing go at and find hard to grasp. So I was talking about narrative writing and practicing the believing game in a graduate class. And one of the students in the class said to me, "But what if they're lying? Don't you have to confront them about the lie?" Well, that's not even salient in narrative research. The truth is not important. What is important is the meaning that people are making of an experience that they're telling you about. They don't have to prove it happened. They don't have to prove it happened exactly the way that they're recounting it. In fact, as they're restoring their lives, they may remember different things. They may interpret their lives differently in the light of further experience. It's not the truth that you're concerned with. It's the meaning of that truth. So this is a typical setup for a collective biography study. And you don't necessarily have to be the leader of that study. You can get someone in actually to facilitate this, and I've seen that work really well. But it often, mostly, takes the shape, I guess, of a collective writing workshop. So you've identified altogether a question, a curiosity, a common experience. A couple of examples I've given you, and then develop questions about that experience, prompts, writing prompts, actually. Then you have sequences of timed writing. So a question might be, when did you first know you were pregnant? You've got 10 minutes. How did you feel about that? What was happening around you? Who did you tell? So you've got 10 minutes for each of you to write that story about yourself. Then, when the 10 minutes is up, you share it, you read it to others, and you each talk about each other's stories. Then another question might be, who was, I'm pulling this out of the air, who was the most surprised that you were pregnant, perhaps? So you rewrite the piece that you've already written, including now that piece about who was most surprised at the news of your pregnancy, and on you go and on you go. So writing, timed writing, sharing, rewriting, sharing, and at some point you get to theorizing about what's emerging from this collective biography. There are probably themes that are emerging that you need to be aware of. So you discuss that and you develop that. Then you work towards the collective account of first pregnancies. And that's your narrative piece. So what are some of those ethical issues that you encounter in collective biographies, well, always power, shifting positionalities that people have as they talk and share and write and rewrite and share again. You may have conflicting discourses about an event. Remember, discourses are sort of those larger socio-cultural narratives. That's not a problem necessarily to have conflicting discourses. It's data, right? You need to decide the authorial voice. Is there one voice, one narrator in this collective biography that's telling the collective story here? Or are there going to be many voices? Are the voices going to, how are you going to, if the voices change, how are you going to manage the of transitions?